in the early 2000s, where all these cars had tons of horsepower, but just the engine builds themselves aren't to where they are today. So we would do a slow out lap just so things don't overheat, like engine wise. And then you're like on lap two. And many of my wins in time attack were we set the lap and then it blew up on lap two.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Billy Johnson, who's an American professional race driver, a development driver, and a racing coach. Despite his young age, Billy's already had a very long and distinguished career, starting as a lot of racing drivers do with kart racing. He's raced in just about anything and everything, including the 24-hour of Le Mans race for Ford. He's also run a NASCAR Cup Series. He's raced in Time Attack and just about anything in between. He's also worked as a development driver on the Le Mans winning Ford GT race car and street car, along with Ford's Shelby GT350 and GT500. And that's just to name the career highlights. As a coach, Billy works with anyone and everyone from beginners through to aspiring young race drivers, right through to professional NASCAR drivers. Suffice to say, Billy has seen a lot and done a lot. So we're here to extract as much information from Billy as we can about essentially how to get involved with racing, what your career trajectory should be if you maybe want to become a professional paid racing driver. And obviously, I'll preface that with the chances of making a career like Billy has in the racing industry are, of course, relatively limited. It's a very difficult industry to break into at that level. We'll also dive into some of the most overrated and underrated race cars out there, and particularly we talk about maybe if you're thinking about getting into racing, what the ideal entry-level track day car is. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Billy. Thanks for joining us. And as we always do, let's find out a little bit about your background and specifically how you developed an interest in cars.
Yeah, so I've always enjoyed things with motors. It doesn't matter if it was a lawnmower as a kid, a ride-on lawnmower, snowmobiles, dirt bikes. Always just had a passion for everything internal combustion. And yeah, worked my way up the driving ranks from go-karting to eventually racing prototypes, NASCAR, and for Ford in the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Okay, that's quite the backstory, and I feel like you've just brushed over that like it's nothing. Obviously, we're going to dive into each of those elements. I'm interested, sort of, at what point did you take your passion for cars and decide that actually racing the cars is what you wanted to do? Because there's not always that particular link. Obviously, a lot of the people we have on this podcast develop a passion for cars, and modified street cars and anything like that will do. It's not always going to go down the path of actually racing.
Well, to race professionally, like let's look at any sport, whether it's football, basketball, you name it, rugby, there are far more teams and players that are paid to do those kind of professional ball sports than there are professionals who make a living and a career from driving race cars. So just the numbers are stacked against anybody who's interested to go down that path. And growing up, like I watched Formula One as a kid with my dad, and just really wasn't 100% focused towards Formula One when I was that age. I just wanted to drive and ride anything with a motor. But started riding dirt bikes when I was 5, and then relatively late when I was 13, I got into go karts. And through racing go karts and obviously being a Formula One fan, that became the dream of racing Formula One. But without a lot of financial backing and resources, which is a huge part of motorsports, kind of my career path was interesting and based off of opportunities, not off of financially created opportunities, and was eventually able to make a living doing what I love, racing cars, and then engineering and helping develop them.
Yeah, okay, I think let's go back a little bit there. I couldn't agree more. My guess is that maybe 1% of drivers with an aspiration to actually make a living out of this can do so. And it's real easy to watch Formula One from maybe the outside looking in without a huge amount of knowledge and think, well, here we have the 20 most talented drivers in the world. And yes, to a point, these guys obviously are incredibly talented, but it's easy to overlook that the talent is only going to take you so far. And I imagine there are a handful, maybe a couple of dozen, I don't really know, of drivers that have the talent to be in Formula One, but never had the financial backing or the opportunity. So it's kind of one of those cases where the stars really have to align, and you need the talent, the financial resources, and then to be in the right place at the right time with the opportunity to have a chance at getting to that pinnacle of the sport. Karting as well, obviously, is the way that most of the drivers have sort of made it to Formula One. I want to talk about that, but just before we dive into your start with karting, let's just talk a little bit about your education background as well. Is there anything in your formal qualifications or education background that sort of feeds into what you're doing now?
So I got a business degree in college, but like I was racing go karts in grade school, and then I was racing in the Formula BMW series. So they're carbon fiber monocoque wing cars that was a big series back in like the early 2000s in Europe and Germany, and then came over to the US in 2004. And that was the inaugural season of Formula BMW USA. So I was racing in that while going to high school and then into college, and had a business or got a business degree, but had a real big emphasis on engineering early in my life through my good childhood friend's dad was an engineer for an IndyCar team, and he really stressed the importance of having a technical understanding of why cars do what they do, how to good understanding of vehicle dynamics, and you don't have to be an engineer. And he actually told me right when I was in the middle of high school, he's like, if you become an engineer or if you take engineering in school, you'll probably end up as an engineer. If you want to be a race car driver, you need to understand the business of racing, because it's not always about being the best driver, because there's plenty of talented drivers out there, just as you said. So in order to make a career off of driving race cars, you have to understand the business. At the end of the day, racing is a business. So that influence on me was the reason why I went after a business degree rather than engineering. But I've always had a passion for the engineering, especially through his emphasis on it. And that was a key factor to the success of me making a living off of racing, was having a real good understanding of vehicle dynamics, why cars do what they do, how to make them faster. And early in my career and at lower levels of racing, you don't have teams with dedicated engineers, or the ones that aren't that experienced. And the more that you can provide value to the race team, and the faster that I could make cars go and set cars up, that was a competitive advantage for me to make a career off of that, because I brought that to the table as well. And then at higher levels, working with eventually world class level people, Then just the efficiency of the driver to engineer interaction became that much better. Setup changes and development became quicker. The car became more competitive, faster, and then obviously that's a big advantage in motorsports.
Okay, 2 points you've just made there that I want to sort of come back and dig into a little bit. You've talked about the business degree, the importance of that, and how motor racing is a business, and I absolutely agree with that. I'm just interested in what are the takeaways from that business degree that you've been able to apply as a professional racing driver that have put you ahead, as you say, of that massive talent pool of drivers who can drive a car fast but maybe don't understand the business of racing.
The business of racing there's not one set direction or path, what from path from a driver standpoint or path from how to make it work and put things together. But I'd say just kind of my biggest takeaway from my business degree, putting it into the context of motorsports, is just understanding the variables, understanding not something as simple as return on investment, although that's the fundamental goal, but just realizing that the days of, oh, you're a fast race car driver, here's a bunch of money to put my name on the car, that's gone. That really hasn't been much of a thing in the last 15, 20 years or more. Now it is more business to business deals. It is a lot more individual focus than it is necessarily corporate. I don't want to say corporate goals because there's even in big corporations, big companies, NASCAR, sponsorships, which are tens of millions of dollars. It still just comes down to key people and what their objectives are, whether they control the money and they're head of finance or marketing. And it's understanding that dynamic, which is the more that you can understand that, the better you can put the pieces together to make something happen, because there is no one path that's going to work for every company in every situation. So the more you kind of understand the big picture, the more you could kind of say, well, this could work with that, and this together can make something happen.
So basically, figuring out from a business standpoint how to put the jigsaw pieces of the puzzle together in order to get the end result that you want. I mean, I think as well what I see from the outside is you can have two drivers that are maybe equally talented and equally fast in the car, but one is media savvy and the other is not. And of course, a large scale sponsor wants someone that is going to do a good job of representing their brand. So if you aren't good in front of a camera or you can't put a sentence together, I think it does put you on the back foot. So having some media exposure and an understanding how to talk to a camera, how to handle a social media profile, and how to put your sponsors in a good light, how to display them in a good light, I think is one of the critical skills that anyone's going to need to develop. And I mean, not even at a professional level. I dealt with a number of drivers through my old business who wanted sponsorship, at grassroots drifting or, club level racing. And we're talking maybe a free tune or a couple of $1,000s worth of parts, nothing much. But again, I saw time and time again people sort of come with their hands out, hey, I've got 35 followers on Instagram and I'm going to give you those exposure dollars. It's like, whoa, are you really? Probably not going to work that well for me. Coming back to the other point that you made about just having that engineering understanding to sort of link what the car's doing with how to improve the car. And from my standpoint, I sort of see there's sort of two drivers who can, again, be equally fast on track. And one's kind of just been fortunate enough to be born with an intrinsic understanding of what the car's doing and then how to change what they're doing on the controls in order to affect the car and get the result they want. So they can be fast, but maybe don't have that sort of deep understanding of why they had to do a particular thing. They just know that, if I do this, I'll get the result. The other driver has that more sort of deep-seated engineering knowledge, which obviously you do, and can discuss with the engineer. So on face value, both seem to be as fast as each other. How much of a hindrance is that lack of engineering understanding going to be for the guy or girl who's just naturally gifted to start with?
Well, I guess it depends on the level that you're talking about. If you're in a lower level motorsports, time attack, you're doing it yourself. and you're racing against other people in a similar light, it becomes, not having that technical understanding becomes a bigger impact and hindrance on your ability to make the car faster. So if both guys in your example are similar talent in or similar speed in the same car, the one with more technical understanding is going to be able to set his car up better. And then now he has an advantage because his car is better than the guy who doesn't know how to set it up. And then that makes a big difference in the end result. And having that technical understanding in my career was a huge competitive advantage for myself to help me move up the ranks to race at the highest level of motorsports. But on the flip side, if you have a lot of resources, if you have a lot of financial backing, and those two examples, those two people are now in Formula 3 or Formula 2 or lower levels of oval racing, you name it, Indy Lights, if you can afford to be on a better team that has a good engineer that can extract the information from the not as technical driver and set the car up to be just as competitive as the more technical driver, then that competitive advantage goes away. So, really, in the success in motorsports often depends on financials. And if you can be on better teams with better engineers, then you don't have to have as much of that kind of skill set and you can still succeed. So I'd say for 90-95%, having that technical understanding is very important, but there are definitely cases where you can succeed without having that understanding. But usually, like I said, that comes with money. But then when you get like the best of the best, when you have the super technical person with the team and support behind them, you get somebody like Michael Schumacher, and then you just absolutely dominate. So, or like a Michael Jordan, where you have the talent, you have the work ethic, and you have the team around you, and you just do incredible things.
Yeah, I think your point's really valid there, and easy to maybe not consider. Here locally in New Zealand, we have an open wheel wings and slicks race series called TRS, Toyota Racing Series. I've actually renamed it now. It's a huge mouthful, which I can't even remember. But that's become, because it's run over the European winter, and in European terms, when you're trading euros for NZD, it's relatively affordable. It's become a bit of a feeder series. I think it also gives you super license points as well. So it's actually become a feeder series, and the likes of Lando Norris, Lance Stroll, Brendan Hartley, and more have all made it from that TRS series into Formula One. But the point I was trying to make here is, obviously you have a number of teams running these cars, and it's basically you pay your money to the team and they run the car for you for the season. And there are some extremely good teams, and there are some that maybe aren't so good. And to your point there, you consistently see the best team getting the best results on track. And yeah, sure, they're also probably, by definition, they won last year, so they're the more attractive team for the talented drivers with the money to go for. So I don't know which one sort of drives the other. But as you said, you've got that engineering talent in those teams to maybe pick up on the data and what the driver is trying to explain as an issue, and are better able to transform that into setup changes for the next session. All right, let's move on to karting. And, as mentioned, obviously, feeder sort of for most professional drivers that have made it into Formula One. I think it's also seen as a somewhat affordable form of motorsport. For a start, let's deal with why it's become sort of the normal stepping stone into a wings and slicks, and then ultimately a Formula One career.
So karts are kind of scaled down Formula One cars. The speed for the corner and the proportions are dimensionally fairly similar. So when you're used to going that fast in a kart through a given corner, when you step up into full size tracks and faster Formula cars, it's very familiar. And also the responses of the cars are fairly similar because Formula cars are very stiffly sprung and have downforce, so their reactions are similar. So transitioning from karts into Formula cars is by nature a natural progression. You can get into karts when you're very young, and I think one of the best things about karting is learning racecraft. So you learn that racecraft when you're younger. It becomes more part of your nature and innate, and then you transition that up into cars. Switching over to showroom stock racing, sports car racing, they're heavier cars, smaller tires, softly sprung, relatively speaking. They move around more. That's a bit of a bigger separation. So you're not going to really have that immediate response from a saloon car that you would have from a Formula car or go kart. But the biggest thing, again, that transitions is the racecraft.
Let's clarify what you mean by that term racecraft. Give us sort of the big picture of what racecraft encompasses.
So racecraft is the chess game of motorsports. So it's not just about turning the fastest lap. That's important for qualifying. That is just a single dynamic of the big picture of racing a car in wheel-to-wheel competition. What racecraft is the outsmarting of the other driver, positioning your car to put them at a disadvantage. It's the studying, it's the thinking. I'm not really a chess player, but to relate that, it is the thinking 3 steps ahead. Very rarely are you just going to happen to come up on a situation and then you pass the guy. You have to plan them ahead. You realize I'm faster in this corner, but I can't get the pass done. So I'm going to position my car here, which makes them miss their apex, which then sets them up in a bad angle for the next corner, which might set them up for a worse angle and a worse exit out of the next corner, which now you're able to put yourself in a position to get the momentum, get the speed going, and then now you can make the pass on the fourth turn. So it's learning that where it's not just here's an opportunity or I'm just going to make a pass randomly here. It's that kind of uh, planning ahead. It is that kind of positioning, and it is learning that again, like chess, to be good at chess. From what I hear, like I'm not good at chess, is you cannot just look one move ahead. You have to be thinking 6 moves ahead, and that's exactly what you have to do in a car, in a cart, and that's what you learn in carts because mistakes are often less costly from a vehicle damage standpoint in carts. Like, yes, you can like launch and flip over and stuff like that. Tends to be on the slightly rarer side, but just like bouncing off of each other or just making mistakes, it's
Consequences aren't quite so high.
absolutely. So it's a great place to learn that, and I truly believe for myself is that is the best thing to learn from in carts.
Yeah, I think, again, for those who maybe haven't got on track at all, you'd sort of think that racing is just all about that optimal line and basically a set of qualifying laps. And when you're actually involved in it, you quickly realise that if you try running a qualifying line on a track with a competitor that's half a car length behind you, they're going to stick it up the inside into the first corner and you're not going to see where they ended up going. So it's all about understanding defensive lines, and as you mentioned there, maybe you've got two drivers who have different areas of a track where they're faster or slower, and then just understanding that, analysing their driving while you're following them, and then seeing where you can actually pick up some speed and maybe plan that pass, as you said, 3 or 4 steps ahead. So yeah, absolutely, I think it's something that karting really can teach. In terms of the actual driving style of a kart, so they're very different. Obviously, there's no suspension. You've got no differential in the rear. So is it safe to say that the handling compared to even open wheel wings and slick style kart is quite unique?
It is unique, but like I said, it is scaled up like a Formula One car. So that's why Schumacher sent a lot of high level Formula car drivers and F1 drivers often drive karts for training because from a physical standpoint it's very demanding and all the neck muscles and driving muscles that you use in driving is definitely taxed in a kart more than it would be a low level Formula car or any other kind of racing car. But yes, they don't have suspension. But going back to it, it's just the proportions of the cart to the cart track versus Formula car to the big tracks that really makes that advantageous.
Just in terms of, you talked about the driver's neck muscles, and anyone who's seen Formula One will have seen the on screen with the G meter, and they're pulling, maybe 4.5, 5G through some of the high speed corners. Obviously, with a kart, they don't have the benefit of downforce like a Formula One car, but can you give us some idea of what sort of lateral G-force a well set up kart is capable of providing?
I haven't been in a kart in many years, but off the top of my head, I want to say somewhere above 2G sustained, and you can have spikes like upwards of 3.
Okay, that's no joke.
Like they're no joke. Those tires are really sticky. Those tracks are rubbered in. You have a real low center of gravity, and it's exhausting. Like most people who don't have that experience go to like a rental go-kart thing, whether it's an indoor or outdoor. And when you drive those, like people tend to be pretty sore after that. And those have nowhere near the lateral grip of like a professional kart. So they could definitely have some kind of appreciation or understanding from that.
Yeah. All right. Now, I mentioned that karts are seen as cost effective, and I mean, sure, they are absolutely cost effective when we try and compare to any open wheeler wings and slicks style of racing. But I mean, what is the reality if you want to be competitive in karts in terms of the actual costs of running and maintaining them?
It depends. Like when I started in a used cart, and yeah, just kind of had to figure it out because I had no family backing, or I had family support, but no family from a motorsport standpoint to guide us. My father and I, we just figured it out. Like you said, less expensive than winged formula cars, but it can be extremely expensive. Like I remember at the highest level when I was racing on a national series in the States, our motors were eight to $10,000, and like the rebuilds were half of that. And you'd rebuild the top ends after every couple races. Granted, the series have changed, motor specs have changed since then, but I still hear about some of those costs where people can and have spent, and even back when I was started, I remember some people had full on rigs, semi truck, lorries, we call them that, rigs, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in carts, and it is insane. Like as a younger person, you're learning that what I said most important is racecraft, but it can be inexpensive, but also it can be extremely expensive. And to kind of have the springboarded platform to Formula One, alluding to back to what we were talking about in terms of the business side of things, it's often being at the right place at the right time and who you know. So if you are going to be in the circles where there's Formula One talent scouts around, you're probably going to be spending a lot of money to be at those races in a competitive cart with a competitive engine. And you may be able to spend the money to be there, but if you don't have the relationship with the engine guy, you're going to get like the fifth best engine, and that's not going to be competitive to the other ones that he supplies that are going to people that he has a relationship with and wants to win. So it's like I said, it's much easier to just be a talented football player and see your talent, you're kicking the ball, you're doing whatever, and uh, through that hard work and talent to get picked up and move forward with that than it is in racing.
Yeah, I guess the absolute best football boots in the world still really fade into insignificance compared to just probably a set of tyres on your kart, correct?
Exactly. Like one set of tires is more expensive than a new pair of boots for every game.
I mean, like everything, there's levels to this, and of course, probably the majority of people listening to this podcast have absolutely no aspiration to make it to the height of F1. So, at some point, it also comes down to choosing your path. I mean, are you doing it for the fun? In which case, you probably don't have to have that last horsepower out of your engine or a new set of tyres on the kart every time you exit pit lane, or are you trying to get in front of a talent scout and actually make a career out of this? And those are two very different paths with very different sort of price points as well.
Well, there's many different forms of motorsport, and really from the emphasis on me to have a business degree to understand the business side of things, it's business and relationships to make that success. And if you want to have your eyes on Formula One, like your family needs to know the heads of each one of those F1 teams to really like honestly that's the more common way to get into Formula 1 is to have contacts at that level. But that's not to say you can't get into any form of motorsports. That's not to say you can't make a living off of racing GT style cars, touring cars, and through that is just meeting people, knowing the teams and understanding how the racing and those businesses work. And the more you understand that, the more people you know, that's how opportunities come about and things can happen.
Definitely. I mean, I think the old story still stands today in that the best way to make a small fortune in motor racing is to start with a large one. And, you know, if you want to get to Formula One, I think that is probably the reality. Have some start by being born to some very wealthy parents, and that's probably going to set you up for a lot of success. Unfortunately, the majority of us don't really have the option to choose who we're born to. All right, let's move on from karts. And another aspect of your career that's near and dear to my heart is time attack racing. And as I understand it, you've had a huge amount of success in time attack in the US, particularly with a specific NSX that we're going to dive deep into. I've seen, particularly with World Time Attack Challenge over in Australia, the sort of popularity and growth of this segment of racing has really sort of come of age, I think, over the last sort of 10 years I've been following it. Obviously got Grid Life over in the US doing a similar sort of thing. What is it from a driver's perspective that makes time attack a unique and interesting form of motor racing?
So time attack is near and dear to my heart. I started in 2002, 2003, driving my uncle's 1972 Datsun 510, powered by a turbocharged 13B rotary engine. And driving a car that was decades older than I was, and I was 16 years old, and beating all these modern cars with significantly more horsepower, that got me associated with the FXMD NSX guys. And that was before I started racing Formula cars. So I was still in karts. And yeah, I kind of, you could essentially say, started my car driving career in time attack. And that's helped teach me a lot of different driving skills that's helped me in professional racing. And it's such a fun and neat form of motorsports because the rule book is very open. You can do a lot of creative stuff with aero. You can do a lot of modifications to your car. And of course, there's different classes that have different caps that hopefully help from a budget standpoint, wherever your talent or budget lands, you can go into the sport of time attack, have a bunch of fun, learn how to make the car faster, learn how to drive faster. But you don't really see that level of openness in that many forms of motorsports. And especially over the last like 10 years or so, with GT style racing becoming so homologated, like you can't change a dive plane on your car. Like it either comes with it or doesn't, or you have two options and that's all you can do. And there's some like GT cars where you can't even change anti-roll bars, or you might only have three spring rate choices to play with, and they're all terrible because the cars were designed for other types of, like on the completely other side of the world, for different style of circuit that doesn't really work, let's say in North America. So that's what I like about time attack. It's like, okay, you might have a tire rule. The widest tire you could run is this. This might be your power to weight ratio. You have some splitter dimension differences or limitations, and then for the rest of it, do what you want. So that's what I really like about it, the creativity from a builder, a tuner standpoint. And that's really, in my opinion, what time attack is about, is car tuning. It is the tweaking on your car. It is the creativity of modifications. And that's what the whole, I guess, import tuning is, relatively speaking, from where you're at in the world, but the kind of tuner world. And professional racing 10, 15 years ago, you had a lot more openness, which was fun and unique. But now that everything's homologated, that creativity is gone. So whether it's for, and I think that's why you see a lot of real high level motorsports people turning to World Time Attack, because they could just stretch their legs and their creativity and challenge their brain with an open slate to do stuff on these unlimited class cars. And then from a beginner enthusiast standpoint, the barrier to entry is lower and you're not as restricted of this is a racing class that has only these types of cars and you're just really passionate about the car that you own and you can't do anything with that. In Time Attack, almost no matter what you have, you can campaign it and play with it. So that's what I really like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the creativity side of things. I mean, I think from my standpoint, I'm kind of a, how would you put it, maybe weekend warrior type driver. I really enjoy racing, but I'm definitely not at a professional level. From an engineering standpoint, enjoy the challenge of making power from an engine. Tuning is obviously one of my key skill sets there. And then just developing a car around a particular package and then optimizing, I find that really satisfying. You're right, the rulebook for Time Attack is relatively open. Probably the only one more open than that, I'd say, is probably Pikes Peak, where you kind of have 4 tyres and some safety equipment and send it. Obviously, there's different classes in Time Attack, as you mentioned there. And we sort of look at some of the upper echelons of Time Attack. One of the things I sort of see as a potential concern is we can get a driver who maybe has a decent budget behind them and maybe not a huge amount of actual experience in developing an unlimited class car or open class car with maybe 1,000 horsepower, which kind of seems to be the minimum now, plus a huge amount of aerodynamic downforce that's allowing them to corner at huge speeds. And maybe they haven't quite developed the skill set on track to handle that sort of a platform, but they're allowed to. Do you see that being a potential concern? Now, granted, a lot of the teams that are actually in this to win it are going to be hiring a professional driver such as yourself and putting them in the seat so they're getting the most out of the car. But to my point, that's not always the case. So I'm interested in your sort of take on that.
There is a potential for disaster in that formula of very high horsepower, very high capabilities in the hands of less experience. But I don't know. I hate to be the kind of person or say from a standpoint of because there's that potential, we should eliminate it now. No, like for yourself, for example, your passion is the engine tuning, it is the chassis tuning, but you do like to drive. Like you're not the fastest professional driver in the world, but if you create a fast vehicle and you want to campaign it because it's yours, okay, it might win or be more competitive with a professional driver behind the wheel. But if you're enjoying driving your creation and being whatever that competitive level is, and if you're happy with, wow, you know what, I'm running fourth or fifth, but on this weekend, I got a third place. I got a trophy. Like, and if that's rewarding for you, I don't see anything wrong with it at all. And because Time Attack is that openness of a rule book and creativity where and you do see that in professional racing. There might be gentlemen drivers who would be just outright happy with a top 5 finish. Or if they happen to get a third place finish and a trophy, they're over the moon. It's like they've won Le Mans. So I don't really, while that potential risk is there, I don't think we should limit people's enjoyment or association in the sport. It should grow and be as popular as anybody or as many people who want to partake in it.
Yeah, no, totally fair point. I mean, I guess ultimately there's a risk involved at every level with every driver, and I mean that's something that you should understand and accept if you're preparing to exit pit lane for the first time, no matter what you're driving. I totally agree with the fact that it's personal satisfaction, and you're right, I could put a pro driver in my car, probably go a second a lap if not faster, but that's also fine. I enjoy driving the car, and if I can get a podium or top 5, I'm going to be pretty stoked with myself. And I mean, at least on this side of the world, your sort of prize money for a win in just about any class is kind of probably a battery voucher or maybe a little plastic trophy. If you're lucky, maybe a check that might almost pay for your tyres and fuel for the weekend. So we're not doing it for that glory. It's the satisfaction, maybe the bragging rights, but really that's about the extent of it. Now, just sort of getting your perspective here from driving an incredibly fast car in a time attack style event, I don't quite know how the rules differ in terms of tread tyre compounds. World Time Attack, which is where I have my main level of experience, they have just recently, as of last year, changed the rule on the control tyre. Prior to that, they were forced to run a very soft Yokohama DOT approved tyre. And basically, the fastest cars with the most downforce would have to kind of ease out of the pits, crawl around on their outlap, trying to not put too much energy into the tyre, and then sort of get up it coming onto the front straight down Sydney's Eastern Creek. And probably around 2/3 to 3/4 of the way around their one flying lap, the tyres would start to well and truly go away. And then, of course, we saw a number of situations where tyres would actually delaminate on or just after the flying lap. So you had one lap to get the job done. You couldn't go back to back with 2-3 laps. And I mean, for me as a gentleman driver, I find I can't come out of the pits, get on it straight away and put in my absolute best time. I kind of need to build up on that. How much of a challenge is that for a professional like you? Can you just turn it on and get the job done, go put the car back away? Or would there be a benefit in being able to do, multiple flying laps in a session?
Obviously, there's always a benefit to doing more laps, especially at lower levels. But at a certain point of professional racing, you are expected to turn it on and be at that speed. And when I was racing the 4 GTs at in the World Endurance Championship, I was at a bunch of tracks I've never been to before, and the expectation is by lap two you're on pace. So my experience in time attack, and I'd say more so back then, a little bit from a tire wear standpoint, but more so from a reliability standpoint in the early 2000s, where all these cars had tons of horsepower, but the ECU technology, the engineering into the engine builds themselves aren't to where they are today. Like billet blocks wasn't even like a possible consideration, and many of the blocks that we were using are nowhere near as good as how strong some of the factory blocks are today. So we would do a slow out lap just so things don't overheat, like engine wise, and then you're like 300-degree air intake temperatures, 300-degree oil, like 250F. These are all F.
Of course. I'd hope so.
Things blowing up on lap two. And many of my wins in time attack were we set the lap and then it blew up on lap two.
I mean, essentially what you're saying is you've got an 8-second drag car that's supposed to perform for maybe a minute 20, a minute 30, or however long the lap is.
Absolutely. So that skill set was a necessity for me back then. It's still a necessity at high levels of time attack today, like you said, because of the tires and because of the amount of downforce. So that's really the limitation rather than engines blowing up. But for the enthusiast, it is a challenge. It is absolutely a unique skill set and challenge to be able to go cold and lay down that lap time and put it all together. And even in professional racing, there's fast drivers that some of them need to get up to speed. Maybe not at the top levels, but there's drivers who get paid to race who need a few laps to get up to speed. And they're also the ones that struggle with qualifying.
Yeah, yeah.
Other drivers who are amazing at qualifying, they can just turn it on and throw down on lap one, and that's optimal for a professional racing tire in some scenarios, and they do well there. But for the amateur, for the enthusiast, that does pose a challenge, and that's probably one of the negatives about time attack for the enthusiast and amateur is the amount of seat time, because for most drivers, it's the nut behind the steering wheel. It is the steering wheel spacer. It is the driver that's the limitation, because you could spend so much money on more power, more downforce, and not really go that much faster. Whereas if you just had a little bit more training and coaching and understanding some of those driving dynamics, you could pick up many seconds. And often people would just rather invest money in their vehicle rather than themselves.
This is a touch out of order, but seeing as you raise it now, let's talk about it now rather than a little bit further on. This exact point of what do I do in order to improve lap times in my car? Now, I've talked about this on the pod before. We used to, through my old business, run track days at a local racetrack. And it was a non-competitive type of track day whereby you were only allowed to pass down the straights. You weren't allowed to pass under brakes or through the corners, so it minimised the risk of panel damage. And these guys and girls are taking their street cars around. You want to get to the end of the day with a shiny car, just like you arrived at the track. So that worked really well. And of course, the bug usually bit for half of the people who went, and they would come back and say, hey, I want to go faster. What do I do? And the usual would be that they would come to us and say, hey, I need more power. And that wasn't my take on the best and most cost-effective way to gain lap time. So I'm really interested in hearing sort of what direction you suggest going. Now, obviously, you mentioned coaching there, so that plays into it. But yeah, give us your perspective.
So I do a lot of driver coaching as well, from beginners to I coach NASCAR Cup drivers, Le Mans drivers, as well as some CEOs and celebrities. But working on yourself is going to be a far bigger return than upgrading your car. So, and especially even like higher level, fairly experienced drivers, they just need higher levels of coaching, but they will still improve more than improvements to the car. So I personally like to focus on the driver before really starting to, like, if you have a limitation, if your car with a professional, or the capabilities of your car will burn up the brakes when driven at 10/10, you got to upgrade the brakes. Like, that's going to be an important thing. But as you go, like, speed costs money. To have a car go faster costs more money. The faster you go, the harder you are on brakes. So then you're going to have to replace brake pads more often. And eventually you're going to have to upgrade the brakes to a big brake kit, because the stock brakes might not be able to handle that. Every situation is different. But adding more power, that's more fuel. Adding more power, that's more demand on the brakes. Adding more power, that's more heat generation. So are you going to run into oil and water cooling issues? And then you're going to have to upgrade those. So it's just a big downward spiral of money spent to make a car go faster. So everybody's situation is different. Every budget is different. But I personally like investing in the driver first, and getting that experience and seat time, and then really looking at what are your goals. If your goals is to race and compete in time attack and have a limited class build car because that fits your budget and everything, then work towards that. If your goal is to race in a local series, touring cars, work on yourself, work towards that goal. But with your statement of people often say, I want more power, that is a less educated kind of desire in most cases. And also maybe it's possibly stemming from some of the format of what you're saying. If you can only pass on a straightaway and you're kind of in a train of cars going sub limit through the corners, then okay, I'm stuck behind 5 slow guys. I only have enough horsepower to get by 2 of them. I'm stuck behind them again until the next straightaway. If I had more power, I could get past all of them and then have a clear track. I don't know. I'm just saying that might.
Yeah, I think there's an element that plays into this, though, that more power is fun. And I'm not going to knock the fact that it is more fun for sure. And also, it's something that you're going to physically notice. You spend X thousands of dollars on whatever it might be, a new turbo, a ECU and a tune, and yeah, hey, you make another 100 horsepower, you're going to feel that every time you put your foot down. So there's sort of that instant gratification for that, as opposed to your point about brakes. I mean, I love a car that stops exceptionally well, but I'll also be the first to admit it's not a sexy modification. But time and time again on the racetrack, you're going to find there's very few production cars, unless you're sort of starting to get up to Porsche GT3 spec. There's very few factory-built cars that have a braking package that is actually going to handle 15-minute sessions on the track without your brakes starting to fall away. So that's an area that's not necessarily just performance-based. It's just common sense and safety. If you can't stop your car, well, you're not going to be able to put in a good lap time. I think, though, coming back one step, even beyond, because I've talked about this numerous times, people come in, they want more power, so we give them more power, and then all it does is sort of amplify all of the problems with the car in terms of if your brakes are marginal with 200 horsepower, they're definitely going to be more marginal with 300 horsepower. If your suspension is stock and it's wallowing through the corners, it's going to just make it more hard to control that car on the edge when you've got more power. So to me, that's not the first modification we should be making. But I think to your point, which I haven't actually talked about before, is track time. Actually, instead of your $3,000 modification to your car, again, granted, assuming that your brakes are up to the task for a moment, I think you're spending that money on track days and actually just getting track time experience, seat time, and maybe putting some money towards coaching. That, probably all things being equal, is a better use of your financial resources. Would you agree with that? Well, it sounds like you do.
Yeah, absolutely. But like if you're into roll racing, drag racing, where power absolutely does matter, and vehicle dynamics and handling, well, of course there is car setup, important stuff for drag racing. But like if you're really into just power, just engine tuning and going down that route, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is a different form of motorsport.
Of course.
And go in that direction. But if you like driving around a racetrack, if you like handling, if you like feeling the balance of a car, well, one, now it's an even bigger envelope of now you have suspension tuning, you have car balance. But in addition to that, and most importantly, is driving. And driving skill sets are more important than making the setup perfect. It's more important than putting the $5,000 coilovers onto the car. Putting that kind of money into, number one, like you said, seat time, and then number two, instruction. That is what's going to be the best return. And in my opinion, I think that's the most fun. Like if you're drag racing, that's a few seconds of fun. And again, different style. But if you like road racing, you're enjoying driving your car. So get as much seat time as you can. That more experience, that more seat time. And whether you're an amateur or have professional ambitions, the more seat time, the better. It is far easier to go to a golf course a few times a week and play a round of golf than it is to go out to a racetrack, either trailer your car or drive your car there. Like, it is just a lot more difficult and expensive to be in the sport of motorsport, but it is better spent on getting that seat time rather than the more expensive suspension, rather than the more power. And I may be a bit of a unique or a nerd, but I do find brakes a sexy modification. When I'm at the track, I look at these cars with big wings and wide bodies, and I look at, and it's like, oh, they have stock brakes. Like they can't be that fast. So I do look at that kind of stuff, and hopefully maybe we will inspire people to start shifting that kind of paradigm where it's like, oh, what kind of brakes do you have? Oh, you still have sliding 2-piston calipers? Dude, you got to upgrade that.
Yeah, maybe that was a little unfair. I mean, I quite like the brakes that we've got on our 8.6 endurance car, and I also like the fact that I know that they're going to stop me every time I press that pedal. Coming back to your point, just because you raised drag racing, that is my background. I mean, even then, I fell into the trap with my own car, which at the time it was retired. We held the Mitsubishi Evo 4-wheel drive world record, and my whole focus, because I'm an engine builder and a tuner, was like, right, let's go. Let's see how much power we can extract out of this little 2-litre engine. And, 1160 wheel horsepower was no joke. But the reality was that it was such a struggle with that car to not break components, to get it off the line without either bogging or just lighting up and sitting there on the spot doing a 4-wheel burnout was such a challenge. And then, we overcame that, and it went 8.2 at 180 mile an hour. So no joke. But we learned from the mistakes of trying to just chase outright horsepower. And with a customer's car that we built later on, which is a later model Evo, we're like, all right, well, what do we need to get the job done? He wanted the late model Evo world record. Okay, 842, which it was at the time. Okay, well, I think we can do this with 1,000 wheel horsepower. So let's just get that and cap it there. So we had a wider, more usable power band. And then what we focused on was car setup and getting the suspension dialed in. And that car 60-footed significantly better than my drag car. It broke way less stuff. It did laps. It got to the end of the track consistently. And in the end, it went 8.3 at 170 mile an hour. So, it wasn't as fast, but I mean, we're talking, marginal amounts of gain. So again, I think even in drag racing, more horsepower isn't always better. And then I got to a point as well about seat time, as you mentioned there, and I kind of got sick of spending more and more money on my car to spend less and less time in the driver's seat. So switched to road racing, which now I'm very passionate about. All right, let's move on, and I want to talk a little bit about the NSX that you were driving. And again, I sort of had to do a little bit of research on this because it's probably kind of borderline a bit before my time, but as I understand, this was sort of racing time attack in the US around the time of the Sierra Evo, which is a very, very well-known Evo time attack car. As I understand, it still holds some lap records as well.
Yeah, we still have records at various tracks around the country that still stand 15 plus years later.
That's impressive.
So, yeah, our performance was really incredible. And we were like Sierra, they were a Formula Car racing team. And David Empringham, who's my friend, we raced in the 24 Hours of Daytona together. Love the guy. And it was just real fun and that was so fun. Like, he had Tanner Faust back there. He had he was a big drifter in the US, stunt driver in a bunch of movies, and now he does stuff with McLaren. And then you have Tyler McQuarrie, who also has done professional drifting. And it was just a real fun time back in the early 2000s, which I would say was kind of the heyday of US time attack. And I can't remember the timing. Like, time attack was, I think, the biggest in Japan. Then it transitioned to the US. I don't know how Australian time attack timing wise kind of ramped up at the same time, but as US time attack started to fall down, that's where, from what I can recall, where world time attack really started to explode. And that's when we were kind of closing out with the FXMD time attack NSX, and Sierra was racing, and Life Motorsports was coming into it, and Sierra went over down to Australia. Unfortunately, we never did, but like, again, bunch of respect for Sierra, bunch of respect for Dave Empringham, but we tend to beat them more than not on many different race tracks. Just the platform of the NSX is really good. It's an all aluminum chassis, low center of gravity, small frontal area. It's a supercar versus a Econobox. Like, not to take away from the Evo, but
well, it is, yeah. Well, when it was a family four-door sedan shopping car that ended up getting a four-wheel drivetrain and a turbocharged four-cylinder engine to go rallying. And I mean, we're very lucky that they did that.
For sure, and I love those cars. I've done competitions in Evos. They're some of my favorite all-wheel drive. I like them a lot more than STIs. But yeah, just the fundamentals of the NSX had superior advantages over the Evo.
All right, well, let's talk about some of those. You mentioned all aluminium chassis, low frontal area, so less drag. Obviously, it's mid-engined. Anything else that sort of feeds into this? Double wishbone suspension, am I correct?
Its double wishbone suspension was decades ahead of its time. Like, some of the most unique suspension arms right now are from the U.S. company Zinger, where they have the organic
generative design style.
Exactly. The chassis is like that. The arms are like that. When you look at an NSX control arm, I'd say it's arguably as good, if not better looking, than the control arms on the generative ones on the Zinger.
And this is probably a couple of decades before the term generative design had even been coined, correct?
Absolutely. And the NSX was designed in the late 80s. So, like, computer aided design, CAD design, computer force, testing different forces on stuff was very primitive back then. And Honda made such beautiful control arms, upper and lower, forged aluminum, front and rear. And still, if you look at a Pagani, if you look at any kind of hypercar, let alone a sports car or supercar like McLaren or Ferrari, their arms don't look anywhere near as beautiful as that first generation Acura NSX. So when you have some, like, decades ahead of its time technology in terms of components, design, all that chassis, like, out of all the cars that I have driven in my professional career, supercars, hypercars, the NSX still always has a very special place in my heart.
It's high praise.
And still, the driving dynamics of it is incredible. I love driving that car.
Okay. So just to dial into that suspension setup a little bit further, I mean, the majority of production cars, if we're not talking about something with an Italian badge on it, generally they favour a McPherson strut front end for packaging and basically cost reasons, usually maybe a multi-link on the rear. But the benefit of the double wishbone suspension is it gives the engineers a lot more flexibility into designing the camber curve into something that's actually going to be more favourable for a track-based or performance-based application. The other aspect with the NSX of this mid-engine design, I'm interested, never having driven anything other than an AW11 MR2, which we won't count as a performance car. How much of a difference does the engine position make on the dynamics of the car and how it affects your driving style?
So the center of mass, engines hold a bunch of mass, drivers themselves are a bunch of mass. All those definitely play a massive a big part of the end character of the car. So those are like qualitative characters. There's some objective positives to them. And I'd say it's more of those kinds of fundamentals. Can those fundamentals overcome or be overcome? And that's really the limitation. So from an aerodynamic standpoint, you have a Evo. It punches a big hole through the air. It's a tall roof line, big car. There's not really a whole lot you can do about that frontal area as you want more downforce. Most of the time, drag's going to go up in a pretty big way too. So inherently, the smaller profile of the NSX has that advantage. And I was on there's some controversy of me criticizing the R34 GT-R.
I saw that, but I
Yep,
couldn't agree more, actually. I think it's one of the most overrated cars in existence.
it is. I do like them.
Oh, me too. I'm just not paying 300,000 New Zealand dollars for one. It's out the gate.
Yep. So again, whatever. Just because something's overrated doesn't mean it's a bad car. But the fundamentals of, let's say, the GTR, you have a cast iron straight six where half the engine is sticking out in front of the wheel center line. You have that massive polar moment of inertia. One, that's really bad for weight distribution, and GTRs don't have good weight distributions because of that fundamental. So it comes down to the fundamentals. If you have a limitation where, let's say, an NSX and a GTR have the same horsepower, but you have more tire than you have power, well, then you have your limitation is that polar moment of inertia in the GTR where it's not going to change directions.
Let's just describe that term polar moment of inertia, because that's one that I know a lot of our listeners are probably, that's just gone straight over their head. So just dial into that a little bit deeper, please.
So for like the polar moment of inertia and Nissan GTR, imagine holding a heavy bowling ball out with your arms extended in front of you. And somebody talks to you behind you, and now you have to swing around to see who was talking to you. When you have that heavy bowling ball stuck out in front of you, it is going to take a lot of effort and time, and it's going to be difficult to pivot and rotate to turn around. And that's the challenge that a nose heavy car, even Supras, are in a similar way to have that challenge. But even worse, the GTR, and even worse than that, some front wheel drive front engine cars where the whole engine sticks out in front of the front axle, that becomes a challenge. Where if you have a mid-engine car or let's say a Viper, the entire engine of a Viper is behind the front wheel center line. It has that massive hood, or whatever, the C7 Corvettes like that too, the Mercedes AMG GT, all those front engine cars have the entire engine, all that mass behind the front wheel center line. So they pivot and can rotate better. Imagine holding the bowling ball against your chest. Now you can twist and turn much faster.
It's kind of it's a little bit similar to, most people can get their head around adding a light-in flywheel to reduce the inertia of the moment of inertia of the engine, but it's not just a case of the mass of the flywheel. What you want to do is get what mass you have closer to the center of rotation. So that's why we go from maybe a 8 or a 9-inch diameter clutch to a little 5 1/4-inch twin plate, because we're moving that mass. Not only is the clutch itself physically lighter, but now all of that mass is located closer to the center of rotation of the crankshaft. So exactly the same as moving the mass of the engine. It's not just the mass of the engine, it's how far away that's located from the center of rotation of your chassis.
100%. And since the company is down in Australia, Carbon Revolution, who makes they're the world's largest producer of carbon fiber wheels. One big advantage of the carbon wheel is exactly what you said on the flywheel, is the center of mass is towards the hub. So while you can have an aluminum wheel that's about the same weight or the same weight, it's more evenly distributed across the spokes and across the barrel, where the carbon wheel is most of that mass is centralized. So that has all those same benefits that you just said, in addition to, more importantly, being a stiffer wheel. A little bit of a tangent, but since they're down in Australia, you guys are in Australia.
I'm
Definitely
in New
worth
Zealand. I'm in
New
New
Zealand.
Zealand. It's like calling an American a Canadian. Just let's get that real clear.
Those are fighting words, so I can respect it. I'm just kidding.
I just want to come back to the R34 GT-R point before we sort of finish off, because probably right now we've got a lot of followers offside. And I think you mentioned it. I don't want to say that the R34 is not a great car. I've always been passionate about actually more the R32 GT-R, and I still would aspire to own one of those at one point. The R34, I think, in its right, is a good car, but not a great car. However, in stock form, they're rated at 206 kilowatts, and granted they probably made a little bit more than that. They're not that exciting to drive, but with even just a modest set of upgrades, and upgrades that don't have to cost the earth, it really, now you start to see the potential of that car. Where I kind of think they went, out the gate with pricing on these is when, Fast and the Furious made them a bit of a cult car, and now we've got the people that grew up, like myself, with the Fast and the Furious franchise, and people get to later life, now we've got a little bit more money, and like, hey, I really want one of those cars that I saw back in that movie, and then it's just sort of bid up the prices, and then of course COVID made things even worse, and just now when here in New Zealand for a good one that's tidy, maybe some tasteful modifications, you are probably in that 300,000 NZD realm, and I'm just like, at that price point, I'm sorry, it just doesn't make sense for me. Back when I sold my business, I had a customer, had a New Zealand new one with some really tasteful modifications, and at the time, just before I sold my business, he sold that car for the equivalent of, I think, about 50 or 60,000 New Zealand dollars. I'm kicking myself to this day that I didn't have the funds to afford it, but that was the reality. At that price, amazing car. And despite the RB26 really showing its age, there's much better engines these days with a lot more technology. It is still, in my opinion, one of the best sounding 6-cylinder engines in existence. So there we go. I do still love the GT-R, just not at the price they're asking for them. Let's get into the sort of engine package in this NSX, because I feel like we've gone off on a massive tangent. So let's pull this thing back. I mean, standard 3-litre naturally aspirated, or the later 3.2 naturally aspirated engines that came out of these probably weren't going to cut the mustard to be competitive in time attack. So what was done there?
So yes, it's a 90-degree V6. Really cool though, because it has titanium rods from the factory and magnesium valve covers, as well as the lower part of the intake manifold was magnesium too. So a lot of neat stuff. It was the second car ever to have VTEC after one of the Civics in Japan. And in order to make the horsepower that we were competing at, which ranged from 600 to 800 horsepower, we had to sleeve the block. So we had Darton sleeves, we had CP pistons, Carrillo rods, and that was like, really, we didn't have to do much head work. The Honda C series heads, it's nowhere near as good as a K, which is incredible, but it was a really good flowing head. So there wasn't a whole lot of head work that needed to be done back then.
I think Honda have always produced exceptional cylinder heads, and really, I mean, I think that's the secret to why Honda engines, the B series, the C series, the K series, are so exceptionally good. And I mean, it's the head, the airflow in and out of the cylinder head that really is the key to making power. The rest of the engine, the bottom end's just there to support it. It's basically a big air pump. So that's really the key aspect, I find.
Absolutely. And that definitely made development easier, because compared to an RB or a 2JZ that you have to improve, you have to do a lot of work through trial and error and development to improve the flowing of those heads to make that kind of power without a million pounds of boost. The NSX made a ton of power with very little boost. The intake air temperatures were not through the roof because the heads flowed so well. So we didn't have any of major challenges from that standpoint, just due to the inherent nature of the head. So just fortifying that bottom end was what we needed to do. As we increased aero and tire size, oil starvation became a big deal. And the real funny thing was is we didn't want to spend $10,000 on a dry sump oiling system, but we'd blow at that time a $15,000 motor. And in one year, we blew 6 motors, and it's like, guys, like we just blew 6 motors.
Yeah, it can be a real sort of hard pill to swallow, the likes of a $10,000 dry sump system, when in its own right it's going to give marginal gains in performance. But yeah, if it's going to save you a $15,000 engine, or in this case, six $15,000 engine, it's a pretty good investment, I'd say.
It is, and once we invest in that, we never had a failure from oil starvation ever again.
Yeah. Now, I think oil starvation is one of those things that until you've actually taken a standard road car on a racetrack and started adding some sticky tires and some better suspension, it's easy not to really give too much of a thought to it. But it's a real issue. None of these factory cars, or very few of these factory cars, are designed to sustain 1.5 plus lateral Gs through a corner, or even under braking.
In our NSX, we were closer to 2 Gs sustained. And yes, the factory system wasn't good enough. Even my stock NSX on like a 235 front, 265 rear, 200 tread wear, which doesn't mean anything. Like tread wear ratings are just absolutely irrelevant. But just modern tires and not even much aero, the stock NSX, I can get to starve of oil, which is a big problem. But when
Wow, that's worrying.
is very worrying, and those engines are becoming rarer and more expensive. And when you said brakes are not that sexy of an investment because you don't get that return of a power from that expenditure, dry sumps are even worse because okay, you might get like 1% better or 0.5% and a few horsepower, but it's a big investment.
It's a very, very poor horsepower per dollar ratio.
Yes, but it's a dollar per dollar save if you know where the limit is and your goal is to be above that limit. And unfortunately, unless if it's a well-known issue, like, okay, some of the LS V8 blocks are known to have oil starvation issues at this kind of performance level, bunch of them blown up. People know where that performance level is. So if you want to operate at that level, you have to do X and Y. We kind of found that out with the NSX, and I developed my own dry sump system with a billet oil pan for my own personal street car. But yes, it takes money to go faster. So going back to what we said very early on, if you want to make all this power, if you want to put all this downforce on your car, there's always going to be a limitation. And it's better to invest in the driver and have fun with what you have rather than learning these expensive lessons by just seeking more and more speed and power.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to take a moment out of our interview with Billy to talk about a course that's going to be perfect if you're enjoying this interview so far, and that is our Race Driving Fundamentals course, which is normally valued at $99. You can use the coupon code Billy50, that's Billy50, and that'll get you $50 off the purchase price, bringing it down to just $49. This course is guaranteed to find you lap time, particularly if you are a beginner when it comes to race car driving. There's a lot that is maybe not immediately obvious as you translate your skills from driving a road car on the street to then driving on a racetrack, and we highlight all of those areas that you need to understand. We start by talking about the traction circle, understanding the amount of grip that is available from the tyres and understanding how that changes as we go into a braking situation, and then transfer that into lateral load as we move through the corner, and then finally on the corner exit as we're releasing the steering and starting to apply the throttle. We talk about weight transfer, understeer and oversteer, brake application, and how you should be applying the brake. This then leads nicely into the topic of trail braking, which is a very powerful way of adjusting the car's handling balance and how it will turn into a corner. We talk about heel and toe downshifting, which is a very important skill if you're running a car with a manual transmission. We talk about ABS versus conventional braking systems and how to get the most out of your brakes. This also includes a discussion on brake bias. We then dive deep into the phases of cornering and what you need to understand about each of those. This includes turn into the apex, mid-corner, and corner exit. A very subtle but really important aspect with driving your car on the racetrack is looking in the correct place. And we continually see that beginner or novice drivers will look essentially just in front of the car. It's very important to lift your vision so you're looking much further ahead. This will allow you to position the car properly, see things that are happening ahead, and prepare yourself for what is to come. We also discuss the correct driving line and how you may need to adjust this driving line depending on priority of certain corners on your racetrack. We also cover defensive driving lines and wet versus dry lines. We also talk about some of the ways you can improve your driving, from onboard video through to visualization and even track walks and simulations. We also discuss data analysis. Now, it's also really important to be comfortable and correctly seated in the car, and this comes down to the ergonomics of your cockpit layout, and we talk about what you should be considering there. This, as I mentioned, is guaranteed to find you lap time. So if you're interested in taking this course, you can use that coupon code Billy50. That'll get you $50 off the purchase of the course, bringing it down to just $49. You are still able to use our payment plan at checkout to break that down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments. Even using the coupon code, you are still protected with our 60-day, no questions asked money-back guarantee. So if you purchase and for any reason at all decide that the course just isn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know and we'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes. Now let's get back to our chat with Billy. Now, I could be completely off track here. I'm simply assuming, and I'm assuming this based on the exponential sort of rate of development I've seen at World Time Attack Challenge of aero downforce, that if you were racing this car 15 years ago, its aero package probably wasn't as developed as the likes of what we're seeing now. Is that fair, or was this maybe ahead of its time?
It was definitely ahead of its time. Like, just from one, the whole floor of an NSX is very, very flat. So with very little work, adding a couple more panels, you'd have a pretty darn good flat bottom on the car. And we didn't have silly diffuser angles that stalled out and looked cool but didn't do anything. Like, we had a lot of consultation from, like, even world-class people that guided some of the decisions on the car. And yeah, we did a lot of stuff with front diffusers, rear diffusers, the wing, and then just having an aerodynamic silhouette to begin with didn't create challenges to overcome. Like you're saying, the Evo being a big car, the GT-R being a big car, and having a lot of drag stock, we had a real good platform, or the NSX is inherently a good platform on so many different levels that matter in terms of outright performance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just interested, not having had too much to do with the NSX itself, with that mid-engined package, does that kind of compromise what you can do with a rear diffuser, or are you sort of, is the diffuser really more rearward of that axle line, so it doesn't really impact on it at all?
It's not that far from the rear center line. So the NSX has big overhang in the back. So there's a long distance from the center of the rear tire to the rear bumper. So that's a lot of volume for the diffuser that we weren't sacrificed on compared to, like, a Corvette, a C6 or C7 Corvette. It's not much room from the rear tire to the rear bumper, or like a McLaren or some Ferraris that would have a relatively smaller diffuser. So since the NSX had a long back end, that just naturally created the room for a long diffuser to be very effective. So again, the inherent NSX was a pretty darn good platform for time attack.
Yeah, okay. Sounds almost ideal. In terms of driver age, I'm not too sure how much or how little you had on that particular NSX, but obviously as time's gone on, we've seen more and more driver aids coming into all forms of motorsport, but World Time Attack or Time Attack in general. I'm talking here about maybe it's not necessarily a driver aid, but it certainly simplifies downshifting, so paddle shifted transmissions, or even a manually shifted sequential that has an auto blip using drive-by-wire throttle. So, again, taking away from the driver's need to manually rev match on a downshift. Then we've got traction control, ABS. I'm interested, every time we post up about any of these driver aids, we inevitably end up getting smashed with a whole bunch of pretty negative comments about how it takes away from the driver skill. And hey, I mean, I'm not arguing that maybe it doesn't, but I'm interested from a professional standpoint. What's your take on driver aids? Do you sort of jump in the car and turn them all off? Are they useful? Somewhere in between?
Yeah, complicated question, variable answer. So for the NSX, we had zero driver aids. We had no ABS. Heck, we had a stock synchronized H pattern transmission beating sequential transmission cars. So if we just put a sequential on there, we would have gained.
That's a couple of seconds a lap, probably.
Absolutely, and especially with the gear ratios of the NSX are very, very limited of bad and worse. it, Being able to have a tighter gear stack for some of the corners would have also made a huge difference. But to answer your question on driver's aids, it really depends. Like, what's your goal? Is your goal outright to go the fastest? Is your goal to really be the hardcore driver, the manual shifting driver? And what I really laugh at often is the people who beat their chest of being the manual transmission preservation society and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, we need manuals. Many of those people are the same ones that's like, I want auto rev matching on downshift. You don't want to learn to heel toe? No, that's difficult, but I want my manual. It's like, well, that's very hypocritical.
Yeah.
And like they want all these like automatic features that take away from the true manual driving experience. So it depends. One, I think like modern ABSs are fantastic, and the gap where a good driver can outbrake ABS is gone away a lot. And like I dealt with that a lot in racing the Ford GTs because our GTLM cars back in that time period, there was also Corvettes, there were Aston Martins, there were Ferraris and Porsches that were in GTLM, like the Ford GT. We didn't have ABS. And then the GT3 spec cars, which is a global classification and now the standard because there's no more GTLM. Those are designed for a lot of pro-am racing with amateur drivers. So they had traction control, they had ABS, and that essentially lower classed GT3 car would give us a lot of headaches under brake zones because you could have a wealthy dentist dive bomb you on the ABS. And yes, it definitely really closes that gap up. Again, especially modern motorsports ABSs, where a decade or two ago, even like good motorsports ABSs could have been out driven by a good driver in a proper twin master cylinder racing pedal box setup in a car. So ABS for a lot of cases, I like that. I'm supportive of that, especially for like amateur drivers, because like to do it right, to not have ABS, you really need to have two master cylinders. You need to have an adjustable brake bias bar, and you need to dial that in, which the people who are doing this kind of stuff are often the ones that are 6 to 10 seconds off the pace, and they need to work on their driving more than they need to worry about taking ABS out of their car. So I like ABS, and also it's way more expensive in many cases to get rid of the brake booster, to put in.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
It is.
Yeah, we've literally just gone through this procedure with our 8.6 endurance car, and the Bosch Motorsport ABS installation quickly blew out into a full pedal box, and then there's the mounting of the pedal box, and anyway, I digress. It's an expensive process for sure, but with some advantages. I mean, I always hear the sort of the battle cry of the keyboard warriors, like, oh, a good driver can outbrake ABS. And I mean, I think you've kind of just sort of alluded to that. I mean, maybe back in the day, yes. Maybe with a current Bosch Motorsport ABS unit, a true professional driver might be able to match it. Maybe it might be able to outbrake it. I kind of doubt it, knowing what I know about it. But it's more a case of, but can that driver outbrake it every corner for a 12-hour or 24-hour race? And I mean, I'm going to put money on absolutely not.
Agreed. And again, at a certain level, you have to perform at that level. But if you put two pros in, like, let's say our Ford GT, GTLM Le Mans car, and one car had ABS, I would also put money on that ABS driven car, just the repeatability and the optimization under like every scenario that they would have an advantage over, like, you name it, put whatever F1 driver in there will not be able to equal it. So yes, ABS, and again, most people when they remove ABS, they just pull the system out and might put a knob inline brake pressure adjuster, which are in many cases just horrible. So don't like any of that. Stick with ABS. We had like three different forms of traction control in the Ford GT, and traction control, it depends. Like it really depends on what you're trying to do. Like we had our engineers looking at wheel slip telemetry while we're driving to tell us adjust these settings to prolong the tire life and reduce tire degradation while we're driving the car.
So that's an easy part to miss there. It's not just about, not losing the car because of wheel spin. It's also about preservation of the tire life. And, every time you're getting wheel spin, or for that matter, if you're locking up, if you're non-ABS, that's just taking a little bit more energy out of the tire, correct?
Definitely. And those systems do optimize things better than in what most cases a driver can do. Relating that to the ABS systems in production cars maybe 10, 20 years ago were garbage for ABS as well as traction control. But modern motorsports ABS and traction control are amazing. And even like what you guys have in your courses for attainable ECUs, what you're able to do with a drive-by-wire throttle. Like I was never a huge drive-by-wire guy when I was doing time attack, and because the systems just weren't there. But through my development on road cars like the production street car Shelby GT350, GT500, Ford GT, and then now working with Gunther Works on their new Porsche Turbo, I love drive by wire. What you're able to do with the throttle response by snapping the throttle blade open under part throttle to spool those turbos to get that response, to have the torque demand go off of that input and desire from what the driver wants to it, priming all those systems. You can't equal that. Like
No, absolutely not.
my uncle's 510, the turbo rotary, obviously a throttle cable, like it had a big turbo on it. I was braking in a straight line, and I remember getting the downshift done, right foot braking, then transitioned to left foot braking in the last part of the brake zone, like in the brake zone, switch from my right to my left foot, and at turn in, I would go full throttle.
so, so it had boost on the exit.
It by the time I got to the apex, the turbo spooled up, and I was getting the good exits. So it was definitely a challenge. But now with
That's a driving style.
yeah, it was a driving requirement to overcome those limitations of a laggy old turbo, which was super advanced back then. But now, like in my road cars, in my NSX, I love the drive-by-wire because I can tune the throttle response. I can make the engine and the turbo do things that wouldn't even be possible with a cable. So
Yeah, I think the days of laggy, slow drive-by-wire are gone. We often get this complaint when we talk about drive-by-wire, but the reality is there is no lag. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I mean, a little off topic, but I'm literally in the final throes of just retuning our Toyota 86 endurance car on Motec's new GPR Pro package. I won't go too deep into it. Essentially, it's a torque-based package. There's a few, it must have drive-by-wire for this, but there's a few intricacies in the tuning. But once I actually had it set up, I finished off on the dyno yesterday, and it's actually amazing to see it all work. You could go steady state, 4,000 RPM, wide open throttle, and in the torque request table ask for, let's say, 500 newton meters of torque, 400 newton meters of torque, and it'd go wide open throttle and get there, and the boost would obviously come up, and it'd sit at 400 newton meters, and the boost would come up, and then as the boost kept coming up, obviously it's making more torque, so you just see the drive-by-wire position would close. You're still at wide open throttle, and it would smack bang sit on that 400 newton meters of torque. Ask for 200 newton meters, and it would snap the throttle closed, and literally in a tenth of a second, you're at 200 newton meters. Now, that sort of control, there's obviously absolutely no way you're going to get that with a cable throttle.
And the drivability that comes from that, like you saw that on the dyno from the data, but wait till you drive the car and how that affects the driving experience. That is completely unequaled in terms of making that drivable. And then you throw a reasonable traction control strategy on top of that. And like let's say the GT500 Shelby, the new Mustang, that road car that I worked on the development of, The traction control system on that car, even experienced drivers would not know that the traction control's on because it engages after the car's sideways to the point where you're now going too slow. Like you won't spin it out, but if you're trying to go fast, it will intervene in ways that prevent you from going slow. And if you want to have fun and slide it around a little bit, it's not going to kick in like what I remember, like a 90s Mercedes, where if there's like a millimeter of tire spin, it shuts down everything for like 5 seconds. And it's like, what
Might as well
happened? And
turn the ignition off, right? Yeah.
exactly. And that drove me insane. I hated.
Oh, which is actually also dangerous on a track, particularly if you've got someone, right on your rear bumper and you get a little out of shape and you've got a traction control strategy that literally just turns the ignition off. Well, that's not going to end very well. Yeah.
There's still some modern cars that have archaic strategies like that too that are dangerous for that exact reason that you said. But there's a lot of them, especially sports cars and performance oriented ones that are quite good. But yeah, what we did with the GT500 was incredible, where you can slide it around and you would have no idea that it's on until you actually need it by giving it the wrong inputs. And I think just kind of the takeaway is maybe from the perception of drive-by-wire, the perception of ABS, traction control, and the criticisms of all those driving things are from possibly for many people the relation of those older systems that were outright terrible. But if you compare the modern stuff or even the stuff that you guys teach and that the modern attainable ECUs and ABS systems that you can buy, they're just so good. But I guess to again circle back and play devil's advocate again, the argument of, oh, just turn everything off, make it pure and raw. I don't know. Like when I do car development testing for OEMs, we had a line of cars, Porsche, McLaren, Ferrari, GM vehicles, and we would assess their lap times relative to the stuff that we're working on, the development cars. I would turn everything off because for the outright performance, I don't want the tuning philosophies or the intrusion of any of those things to take back of, because they're not going to make me faster. They're not a motorsport level thing that might gain me some time over the whole stint of a tire in a racing situation. Even the Shelby one, like the GT500's traction control program, it only affected me by a few tenths of a second per lap if I have it on versus off. But most cars, it slows me down way more to have it on than have those systems off. So when I did the benchmarking, I would just turn everything off and just feel out the cars. So there are some reasonable arguments for not having that, but I guess it comes down to what's the goal? Are you trying to go faster? Are you trying to be more consistent? Or do you just want to purely enjoy the experience of driving? And that's probably the fundamental question that should be asked.
Ultimately, I think there's a bit of, it depends. It's personal preference here. And I mean, I'm not here to knock someone who wants a fully analog experience. I mean, for me, I'm a bit of a technology nerd, so I like experimenting with these features and functions and seeing how well they work and what I can achieve with them. And as already noted, gentleman driver here, not aiming to be the next Max Verstappen, so that's fine. I kind of know where I sit in the pecking order. Let's move on. I just want to quickly dive into Le Mans 24-hour racing, or endurance 24-hour events in general, because I don't often get the chance to chat to someone who's been involved at that level. So you got to race the Ford GT at Le Mans, and I'm just wondering, what is the build-up process look like from a personal standpoint to cope with an endurance racing event that's that long? And I'm talking here about nutrition, physical fitness, mental sort of fitness. What do you need to be doing?
So for like the 24 hours of Le Mans, that is essentially 24-hour qualifying laps. You are running at 10 tenths the whole time. The days of like Ford versus Ferrari, the 1960s, and heck, even into the 90s, you had to take care of brakes. You had to take care of transmissions and engines and not take them to red line because they won't be reliable and last that much. Also, the cars made a lot of horsepower back then, whereas now, like a GT3 level car is around a 500 horsepower car, compared to in the 90s, there was some like 900 plus horsepower GT cars, the GT1s, which were my favorite series of or classification of cars that raced. But since the cars now are really relatively lower powered, more momentum cars, high downforce, and the reliability of all these systems are so high, you are running at 10 tenths the whole time. So that is way more physically and mentally demanding than it is trying to manage a transmission or manage the brakes. It doesn't take as much physical or mental capacity when you're driving at 8 or 9 tenths or whatever, 9.5 tenths. But when you're at 10 tenths, like a legitimate 10 tenths for so long, you have to be in good physical shape. So cardio is extremely important. Having the physical strength to not get fatigued from having to turn that wheel, they're physically demanding cars to drive. You're still in many corners pulling 2Gs or more because they're uh, banked corners. It's really demanding.
What's the sort of stint length for a driver? I mean, I'm guessing it might depend on strategy and what's happening in the race, but yeah, is there sort of an average stint length that you would actually drive between breaks?
It all depends on strategy. And right now, and over the last few years, the rule book kind of limits a stint length to around 50 to 58 minutes, depending on the car. So usually drivers will do one to two stints. In some cases, that's most common. Some cases they'll do three, but it's all depending on the strategy, where you are positioning, what happens with yellow flag cautions and fuel economy. And like for me, between like the 24 hours of Daytona and the 24 hours of Le Mans, more than once I was in the car for nearly 4 hours straight.
Holy that's insanity. Wow.
And the worst one was Daytona because like during hour two, I'm like, I have to pee really bad. And I'm like, oh, I can handle this. It's like, okay, whatever, 30 more minutes left of stint two. All right. And then something happens and they're like, we need to do another stint. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I have to pee. And then the 3 hours over and I'm dying. And then another yellow comes out and they're like, you're staying in the car. I'm like, no, like put him in. And like, no, you're staying. I'm like, I can't do this.
Wow. Yeah, I can only imagine.
So that made it even worse than just the physical demanding thing. But like there's other races and different 24 formats that having longer, like 3 hour, 4 hour stints are more common. Like the 25 hours of Thunder Hill, which is our longest race in the States that happens in Northern California. It's not at that professional of a level as like Daytona or Le Mans, but like people have done 5 6 hours. I've done a 6 hour stint in a E46 or E36 M3 when we won that race at night, and that was just fun because granted that car would pull 1.5 Gs sustained. It had a decent aero on it, but yeah, just you're not operating at that same mental and physical level as like Le Mans.
I'm just interested with the sort of driving at 10 tenths. I would have assumed that there was a bit of tire management that would have gone into this. It sounds like that's not the case. These tires are good enough to do an entire stint, and you can drive them 10 tenths without the tires sort of falling to pieces.
It's pretty complicated, and what's really neat is Michelin will make special constructions, the actual belt layup and plies and everything. In addition to the compound, they'll make custom specific ones for each platform.
Okay.
So, like a Corvette will have a different tire from Porsche, will have a different tire from a Lamborghini. In some situations, like they may have to share them until the next generation comes around where they get to refine and make their own custom one. But at the end of the day, super high level custom tires at that performance level. And there is a degradation. So lap one's not going to be as fast as, or the last lap's not going to be as fast as lap one all the time. But there is fuel burn. So as the car burns its fuel down, so in some cases, at the end of a stint can be quite fast or sometimes even faster than an early stint. It also depends on the platform of the car. If you have the fuel tank that's in the front and your weight distribution changes, there's a lot of variables. But at the end of the day, you are running at 10 tenths, but you have to run at 10 tenths and not abuse the tire. If you just view qualifying as like, I'm just going to destroy and slide these things around, that's not really the case. If you do slide the tire, every time you slide the tire, that's extra wear and extra heat. And both of those will affect the performance at the end. And if you are too hard on them early in your stint, you're going to have more tire degradation and you're not going to be able to perform later in the stint. So it's an interesting balance of maybe I can go 2/10 quicker, but am I going 2/10 quicker and doing micro slides a little too much where I'm going to lose 4/10 on the backside?
Yeah, yeah.
You are at 10/10, but you're trying to find that balance, keeping it in that window without overdoing it. So in qualifying, you don't really care. You're not trying to kill the tire, but you could slide it around a little bit and you're just trying to do whatever it takes to put that time together. But in your Le Mans stints, you're trying to be in that window with zero excess wasted motions.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. In terms of the balance of the car over the length of a stint, as the tyres do degrade and, as you mentioned, as your fuel burns off, what sort of levers, physical and metaphorically, have you got available to pull in order to adjust the balance to suit you?
So that's what I really miss. I really liked the tube frame GT cars that we had in the States, and also like Trans Am style cars back in the 90s, then GT cars in like the 2000s, where you had adjustable roll bars. I really miss that. I wish more racing series adopted that or allow that. Now with all the homologation, like that's a zero chance of that happening. But I loved racing those kinds of cars because as the balance changes, you can stiffen or soften a front or rear bar, and you have more control as a driver to affect the performance of the vehicle. Most racing doesn't have that. So the workaround of that is, and actually I was taught this by one of the race engineers for Dale Earnhardt, the original Dale Earnhardt, and Dale Earnhardt Sr. And when I was told this early in my career, before Dale's passing, was that he would drive into corners if he had a loose car, oversteering car. He would drive into corners harder and start to wear out the front tire to gain the balance back.
That's interesting. I wouldn't even thought of that.
That is 100% a true thing that I've done in my driving throughout my career. Was if you have an oversteering car, you can go turn the exact same lap and carry another 2K or whatever, 1 mile an hour, 2 miles an hour, 3 kilometers an hour harder into a corner, lean on that front tire more, and kind of scrub the speed getting into the corner and turn the same lap time, but you are using more of the front tire. Whereas if you drove it normally with the normal driving style and your normal, you'd be chasing the rear because the front has 100% grip. The rear, through car setup or just the rear tire was wearing out fast or whatever it may be, if you drive it to 100% of the front grip and that's the rear can't stick with it, then you continue to wear out the rear and that problem gets worse.
Yeah.
So from a driving standpoint, if you drive differently around the car for a certain period of time, you will feel the balance start to change, and then you can back up your brake points or your corner entries and go back to a normal thing, or vice versa. If you have an understeering car, you get it slowed down, you take it easy, and you're not grinding off the front tire down to the apex. But then once you get to the apex, get on throttle a little bit before you would normally because you're slow in, and then just stomp on it and lean on those back tires, not where you're spinning them and getting sideways, but just a very small emphasis of changing that to then work the rear tire a little bit more, getting off the corners. And you do that after 5-10 laps and the balance starts to come back. So that is the main thing that you do at that level to get the balance to come back. Although personally, I'd rather just have those knobs.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a higher level of driving, more nuanced thing.
I mean, I think that's a really novel take on adjusting handling balance, mid stint. Really interesting. I think adjustable anti-roll bars make a lot of sense, but then of course as well you have to know what adjustment to make to those anti-roll bars to affect a given change. But then, of course, you've got the radio and your race engineer. So if the driver doesn't inherently have that knowledge within them, the engineer should probably be able to advise what magnitude of change to make to the front or the rear bar if you're suffering, understeer or oversteer.
But back then, like now that I'm recalling, especially like gentleman drivers, but even like seasoned drivers, I remember that they would just do dumb things with the bars and come in, and the engineers are like, "Why the heck is he doing that?" Like,
Less opportunity to get it so far out of the ballpark you can't see your way back. Yeah, that's fair.
yes.
All right, so let's move on. We're sort of getting a little bit light on time here, and there's a sort of couple other parts that I wanted to talk about here. You've obviously got a lot of experience as a race driver, and you've mentioned you've done some driver coaching. So I'm just wondering if you could give our listeners some tips here. So, are there maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 common mistakes that you see novice drivers making when they've got their car on a racetrack?
For me, like, my coaching philosophy is more in line with teaching the procedure. And I think that's kind of the key. Driving fast is not about having big balls. It's not about just your hair on fire and manhandling the vehicle. It's more nuanced, and it is more the execution and going back to the engineering side, understanding of vehicle dynamics. So kind of my best advice would be to read some vehicle dynamic books. Understand understeer. Understand when a front tire is sliding too much, a rear tire is sliding too much, and the friction circle, and what your objective is truly for driving. Like hand position is important. There could be like, oh, slow in, fast out, all this kind of stuff that is thrown around in all sorts of different contexts, like a conversation like this. But I don't really like that norm of recommendations. My recommendations is different. It's like, if you want to drive, if you enjoy it, invest the time into your driving. Invest the time. Just buy the book. I'm not a huge. I've never really liked reading. I love reading technical articles and stuff like that, but just reading books has never really been my pure enjoyment. But if you do like driving, get books. Get like Drive to Win by Carol Smith. Get some reputable books, maybe by some local authors, and have that understanding, because knowledge is power, and seat time is key. Seat time is important, but practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect.
Yeah, if you're practicing the wrong things, it's not really going to help you.
Exactly. You're creating bad habits. You're ingraining bad things. So if you understand, hey, this is how it kind of works. Like, you don't have to know the math behind damper curves and all that, unless you want to do the setup and go down learning that from an educational and car setup standpoint. But just from a driver, have the understanding of that. If you don't have the budget to do a racing school to learn that there, you could buy a book for not very much money and learn that, and then implement that. Like, it's a practical use thing. So you're learning about something. Next track day, try it and work on that. If you have the budget, consider a driving coach. There's also lots of bad ones out there, but there's usually always something good to pick up from that and invest in yourself. So one, that would kind of be like a blanket statement. Another one would be learning car control. That is crucial. Like, I wrote an article on motoiq.com about car control and learning how to approach that safely, and also the challenges of car control, because most track events don't like people spinning out, because safety is number one, safety for liability and all that kind of stuff. So it is really hard to learn.
I actually think that's probably one of the benefits of getting started with karts is it's a quick, easy, and relatively low stress, low consequence way of learning a lot of that car control.
I would say no. I would kind of go against that, because carts are pretty twitchy, and the difference of like going over that limit and spinning out versus being able to catch a big slide. Sprung cars, sprung platform saloon cars, touring cars, GT cars move around way more and are way slower in their response than carts. So learning how to catch an oversteer situation.
Maybe not so much learning to catch an oversteer situation. I think probably where I'm going with that is more being comfortable with the car or cart moving around underneath you, which obviously coming from a road car driving on the street, if you want to keep your license, that's not normally how we're driving. So then when we see people take their cars on the track for the first time the car starts to move around, they freak out. It's just such an unnatural experience. So that's kind of what I was getting at. Yes, of course, the response is very different.
I'm all for getting seat time in karts. It's fun. It's a different challenge and a slightly different skill set. Love it. It's great. Do it. But it really is a challenge to learn car control because you can't, like, for catching oversteer moments and feeling the body flopping around and moving around. Karts don't do that and don't teach that aspect of it. So, how do you learn true car control to catch oversteer situations, to mitigate understeer, to learn to drive at the limit? Because at the end of the day, the whole point of a road course driving is to keep the car at the limit the entire time, under brakes, transitioning down to the apex, powering out of the corner, keeping it at that limit. But if you go over that limit, there could be consequences. So how do you know where that limit is? How do you work up to that? And having the right processes, and that's what I teach in my coaching, is how to inch up to that. Reading a lot of books will teach you a reasonable amount on how to do that. And that's probably the best and safest thing, is knowing the process and then working towards that is going to get you there and keep you safe. It's not about, I went through the corner, I don't know, it was okay, and I'm just arbitrarily going to go 10K faster, 10 miles an hour faster into the corner and see what happens. So knowing the right approach, that is one of the most important things to keep yourself safe and to make practice and seat time move you in a positive direction without plateauing.
Yeah. I'm interested what your thoughts are on where, if at all, simulator training plays a part in improving your on-track performance. Obviously, we've seen the likes of iRacing, really explode in popularity since COVID. I do use iRacing and some other platforms as well, particularly Assetto Corsa. I've used that to learn tracks that I haven't been to before in New Zealand. Unfortunately, iRacing don't come and laser scan tracks over here in New Zealand, so I kind of have to do what I can do. And I mean, what I have found is like maybe it doesn't have the exact nuances of the track surface that a laser scan track will have, but at least you know which way to turn when you come out of pit lane. You kind of can build up a bit of a knowledge of maybe where the key corners on a particular track are, driving lines, etc. But of course, with a simulator, we lose that sort of seat of the pants feeling. You're not being exposed to the G-forces that you are in a real car. And of course, the consequences are less significant. It's pretty easy to press the escape key.
I do like simulators. Like when we developed the 4GT street car and race car, we had a $3 million simulator that we would do development on before the car was even in existence. And then we would do testing prior to going to racetracks, and then some NASCAR consulting I do for a NASCAR Cup team, constantly do development stuff on that. And those things move around and are amazing, but not attainable for most people. But when I wasn't testing and working on those $1 million simulators, I didn't have a trick amazing simulator setup at home. I had like a folding chair on a flimsy table, and I had good pedals, which are key. The pedals are so important. And I didn't even have a direct drive wheel. I had the belt driven wheel that had slop in it. And I used it mostly to learn tracks. So the laser scan tracks are fantastic, but I also had to use Assetto Corsa because I was competing on tracks that weren't on iRacing. If you're going to go to a racetrack, and especially if it's like a destination, if you're going to go to Spa and rent a BMW 1 Series to drive around and do all that for fun or whatever, yes, getting that kind of seat time, and especially if you kind of compete, like if you do any sort of competition and there's a circuit that you actually are going to go to, that is invaluable because you're getting seat time that you can't get any other way. And back to the golf example, if you can go golfing almost every day of the week to get better, racing is just, even if you could afford to go to Spa or go to your local circuit every single day. Like that's not really a possibility. You can on the simulator. So to stay fresh just from the ins and outs of driving, massive for that, massive for learning new tracks. Like Max Verstappen is on it like before real race F1 race days. Like it's ridiculous, but it works. So I like all of that, but then to a degree, there's its own nuance. You can gain all of this knowledge and even play around with car setup and learning lines and all that kind of stuff and learning different lines and how that may help you. Or racecraft on simulators are also fantastic. Where am I gonna pass somebody at Donington Park in England? And that worked out great. And I won that race when we raced the Mustang GT4 out there. The simulator is so good for all of that. It's not good for car control. The tire models, it is extremely difficult to model tires in simulation. It's difficult for Michelin, like one of the most advanced tire companies in the world, difficult for Goodyear, difficult for any Formula One team and iRacing, all of that. So to model the way the car starts to rotate and then oversteer and how you can catch those things, even if you have a direct drive wheel, even if you're on a $1 million simulator, that is still the kind of forefront of area of improvement that there needs to be a lot of. But it's so difficult. So you're not going to learn. You could learn some decent amount of car control and understeer mitigation in simulation, but you're not going to learn true countersteer and oversteer correction in simulators. You can learn a lot. I would say you would learn more on a simulator for that type of stuff than maybe a go-kart. Go-kart is good for like physical endurance and some, like they're all different disciplines that have different strengths and benefits to it. I would say I might like simulators more than karting for most situations. But if you want to go into, if somebody's like, how do I drift? How do I learn how to power slide through corners? It's cool. I want to have that skill set. That's hard to do. It's hard. There's no real easy path to do that. Plus, it's expensive because of all the tires.
Definitely, yeah. It's just another tool in the toolbox, really. I think the benefit, of course, is once you've got a simulator, and I mean, it doesn't have to be a $20,000 or $30,000 sim to get going. It's obviously cheap or almost free to spend time on the sim. So I think it's definitely worthwhile. But yeah, just another tool in the toolbox. It's not in and of itself going to turn you into a professional racing driver. I've got two more questions before we move into wrapping this thing up, and I'm just interested to get your sort of feedback on this. If our listeners are looking to get into a track day car, maybe they haven't got something that's suitable right now, what would be your pick of a suitable road car that lends itself really nicely to the track? And let's sort of say that we've got two budgets here, one under $10,000 and the next under 50 grand. And we'll call this USD. So yeah, what would be your pick?
So for under 10,000 USD, Miata is always the answer.
Fair. Yeah. Should have been a predictable one.
Yes. They're awesome. They have upper and lower control arms, front and rear, 50-50 weight distribution, like whole engines behind the front wheel center line. They are a proper little car. There's a reason why they're the most raced car in the entire world, because there's millions of them, and they're just a great platform. So I always like Miata. If you're a taller guy, I get that's a challenge. So I don't know. I'm going to say default Miata, but definitely if you're taller, that might be a challenge.
Yep. Okay. And if we're a little bit more well endowed in the wallet, 50K under?
50K, that's tough. I hate to say it, but I have my own project car, and it's not going to be relative to you guys because you guys don't have them. Well, I don't know. Do you have Mustangs now, right?
Yes, we do. Yep.
What, and they came in 2015 in the global car?
Yeah, it would be there or thereabouts. I couldn't give you a specific date, but yes, yep.
Are they under 50?
They actually might be.
Like a 2015, that's now almost 9 years old.
Yeah, I think they probably would be, actually.
So in the States, like we have older Mustangs that the S197 is a solid axle, and you can actually get those for like $12,000. And I had a build a budget track day car on motoiq.com. It was a budget Mustang track car. And my goal for that was have a track. What is the cheapest way to have 400 horsepower at the tire and have a competent track car? And that build, that was a 2014 model. So that's the older style. That's like 2010 to 2014. And those were way more affordable. But with very little money, not even coilovers, just upgraded shocks and lowering springs, and then like a catback exhaust and an intake, we made over 400 horsepower at the tire. The Brembo brakes from a newer model Mustang, 6 piston or 4 piston in the front, put those on and they won't fade. And the purpose of that was like, okay, there's a lot of BMWs that are 300 horsepower or so, and those are very common things to do. The challenge of this build was, can you really get 400 wheel horsepower and not burn up the brakes and have it be competent and handle well? And that build was focused around that, and I really like that recommendation. But if that's more like in a $20,000 to $30,000 budget in the States when we have those older cars. For you guys, I like the 2015 Mustang because you don't even, if you get the performance pack with the 6 piston calipers, just put pads in there, you're not going to fade the brakes. And the tires hold up and they're just great platforms.
I mean, just while you've been talking there, I just pulled up Trade Me, and yeah, I mean, 2015, 2016, we're looking at maybe between 40 and 55, 60,000 NZD. So what's that? Somewhere in the 30, 35,000 USD vicinity. So yeah, it fits the bill.
Yeah, so that gives you some money for track pads and some of those other small things. But I really like that Mustang platform. If I can flip it around, what is kind of your go-to in that category?
That's a great question. I should have probably really thought this one ahead. I think probably, something in the BMW 1 Series has been really, really popular. I admit, as I say, that I'm not a BMW guy, so I'm not quite up with the pricing of those. I mean, in the lower price category, I am skewed here because I've had two of them and continue to race one of them. I think the Toyota GT86 platform is exceptional. I mean, I think it kind of there or thereabouts with the MX-5, but obviously there's a higher price point to get into that.
Yeah, I really like the 86 because again, speed costs money, and Mustangs are heavier. So even though you can have the brake pads hold up, they're going to wear out far faster than the GR86.
Yeah, that is actually a point that I think is really easy to overlook when you are choosing a car is what does the weight do to the wear items on the car. So brake pads, as you mentioned, but also you're going to beat up on the tyres a lot more as well. I'm a big fan of a lighter platform. I think it just makes everything easier. And I mean, I think to get started, your point around 400 horsepower is great. Probably to get started, we probably don't need that much horsepower. It sort of comes back to our earlier conversation. Starting with something that, if it's underpowered, you get into a corner, it's all going really, really pear-shaped. You're sort of probably going slow enough that you can just about take the belt off, open the door and get out before it hits the wall. And, that it's not the end of the world. As you start adding more power, when things go wrong, you're just inherently going to be traveling faster. So I think it comes down to, of course, your skill set. I think, starting with something like an MX-5 or a GT86, stock standard in terms of power, that's a great starting point. Obviously, once you've done a couple of seasons of racing, you've started to build up some skills, you're going to want to progress to a more powerful platform, and that's just a natural progression, I think.
So yes, the 2015 Mustangs with their 19-inch wheels, it's hard to put 18s on them in some situations, but that older S197 Mustang that I did the track car on, those run 18-inch wheels, big tires, and that has a mass to tire ratio where that thing doesn't wear out tires that bad. So that build, which unfortunately is not relevant for you guys down there, is great as a difference than some of those BMW options. Although the new 1 Series and 2 Series, I did track those recently, and they're extremely capable and a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. I think we've probably provided a fair bit of information to everyone listening on where to get started with track days. And I think the takeaway there, at least from my perspective, less is more when you're just getting into it. We have taken up a lot of your time though, so I'm going to move on to wrapping this thing up, and we've got, of course, the same 3 questions we ask all of our guests, and the first of those is, what's next and in the future for you?
So yes, I've done a lot of development in the past, a lot of racing, putting together some racing deals for the second half of this year. So a lot of racing in store, as well as some pretty cool projects that I'm working on. Can't say too much at the moment, but one, like, I'm doing stuff with Gunther Works on their Porsche Turbo and continuing with that. I'm also consulting for some other car companies and new companies that are bringing things to the market that are pretty darn exciting. So hopefully all those move forward in a positive direction. And yeah, that's going to be real neat once I can talk about that.
So a whole lot of exciting stuff that you can't share with us. That's just perfect. Understandable, though. We understand how an NDA works, so no disrespect there. Next question, is there any advice you give to a younger version of yourself, or perhaps one of our listeners, to help sort of fast track where you've got to in your career?
It would be the importance of networking. And I hate to say this, but in like today's day and age, who you know matters, and it's always mattered, but who you know often matters a lot more than what you know or how good you are. Throughout my career, I focused so much on being the best, setting the car up the best, having the fastest car, getting all the wins. And that doesn't ensure a ride, that doesn't ensure success. Results on track back 30 years ago, you could be the biggest jerk in the world, not politically correct, not a good, not even a marketable person. And if you won, people would hire you. But now the importance of representing well, the importance of networking, the importance of relationships are more important than the actual results. And the advice to myself and to the audience would be is network, meet people, develop those relationships, because when you develop those relationships, the sky's the limit in terms of those kinds of opportunities. If you stay solely narrow focused on just having the fastest car or just winning and not developing the relationship with the series sponsor, with other people in the paddock, you're probably not going to go very far.
It sort of really comes back full circle to what we were talking about near to the start of this chat, where the talent is only going to take you so far. And that networking is always been a powerful skill. Probably a little difficult for the more introverted among us, but like any skill, it's a skill that can be worked on and developed.
So it was more comfortable and easier to just stay focused on looking at the data to understand how to make the car go faster and then beat everybody. But then guys who were nowhere near as good, but were likable and very social, got, in some cases, better opportunities or got to drive for the better team with the better engineers. And then, okay, they're now a challenge to beat this guy, even though they're not that great. They're in a better position. And it's like, okay, well, no, just outright winning doesn't, in today's day and age, necessarily get the best opportunities. So you have to have both.
Got to be the entire package. All right, last question for today, Billy. If people want to follow you, see what you're up to, how are they best to do that?
Through probably the social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are all at Billy J Racing, Billy, the letter J Racing, or my website, billyjohnsonracing.com.
Okay, as usual, we'll put links to those accounts in the show notes so that it's super easy for people to find. Look, Billy, it's been a really, really interesting chat. Great to get some perspective on everything that we've covered from the likes of yourself, a professional driver, and it's been an eye-opener for me, and hopefully all of our listeners have also learned a bunch. So thank you for giving us your time.
Well, it's been a lot of fun, and thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Billy, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Dayton E from the US, who has said, "Awesome podcast, extremely informative and a delight to listen to while I work, and I can't watch any of the courses. Just finished every episode and ready for what's to come. Keep up the good work." Well, thanks for the kind words, Dayton. Great to hear that you're getting so much value out of the podcast. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.